Okay, so what do they do with this? Lyle, how do they clear the space to make Blake Snell happen?
You're going to have to trade somebody off your roster because you are going to have to clear more money. And we talked about this pre-recording. I think the one that makes the most sense is Anthony DeSclafani. He's owed $12 million this year. The Mariners have a surplus of starting pitching, even with him. And if you're going to bring in Blake Snell, you certainly don't really need DeSclafani. So if there's a team out there, and it could be any of the other 29 teams that just need a fifth starter going into the 2024 season, that's what you pitch. You say, hey, take on DeSclafani's money. You can have him. That's the trade. Maybe you get back some really low-end young prospect in return. But that's it. Say, take DeSclafani's money, maybe give us a little bit of cash back. No, that wouldn't really make sense because they're going to take on his money. So if you just say, take DeSclafani and his money, and we'll call it a trade. I think that's what you do, right? Because it clears up $12 million.
That's the easiest one. I said Ty France too, but Ty France's number, especially in arbitration, actually was significantly lower than I thought it was. I think we were mentioning, I was mentioning, I saw the number on Spotrac that Ty France was projected to get about $9.6 million in arbitration. Well, the number came out today. He's actually getting $6.7 million, which is significantly lower. You couldn't just trade Ty France's contract and shed enough money, I think, to make this all work. So that's why DeSclafani, the trade makes sense. I'm with you. I would just give him away as long as someone's willing to take on the $12 million. Hey, you need a starter? Blake Snell can happen for us if you just take this away. Great, perfect. We don't need anything back. It works out great for Anthony DeSclafani because when he hits free agency next year, instead of being a swingman pitching 70 innings out of the bullpen this year, he instead could have a full year of starting in a major league rotation and significantly and cash in on his future and be generationally rich with whatever next contract he could potentially get, especially if he goes and he pitches well somewhere. So I think that's great. I think that's a win-win for both sides. I think DeSclafani would be happy with that as well because he's got a tough battle to get any sort of starts in the rotation. It would require injury. So that's step number one, shedding salary. I think that's a pretty easy one. There are other more creative ways you could shed salary, but that one makes the most sense and is in the highest demand. Starting pitching is always in the highest demand, and the Mariners have a significant amount of starting pitching. Now, what about the rest of the starting pitching? Is there a strategy that you would tinker with the roster a little bit to make Blake Snell fit in there?
So if you sign Blake Snell and trade DeSclafani, you're still six starters deep between Luis, Kirby, Snell, Logan Gilbert, Brian Wu, Bryce Miller, and then if you want to throw in a seventh with Emerson Hancock, they're still extremely deep in their starting rotation. But in terms of what they do as a result, I don't know. Do you think Miller or Wu would still get traded if they signed Snell? I'm not so sure anymore. Just between Robbie Ray and Marco Gonzalez both being off the roster, and the fact that Brian Wu may be on an innings limit, and the fact that Jerry and Justin did not seem to like what the market said about Miller and Wu when they were fielding calls on him.
Now, that's what the market says right now. What if the Mariners take one of the premier starters off the market and sign him? Then starting pitching, again, becomes a little bit more valuable, especially 5 years of control with a starter. So you take the $28 million a year pitcher over 5 years off the market, and instead you're like, hey, I have 6 years of control here, 3 of them for league minimum, and then 3 of them in arbitration as well. Does that sound more enticing now? Are you willing to come up and meet my price? This could honestly be a negotiating tactic to drive up the price of Miller and Wu because you're essentially cornering the market yourself. You are hoarding all of the goods on the market of starting pitching that people want and then saying, oh, you want some, come and get it, pay our price. And then some team, if they're desperate enough, might walk up to Jerry DiPoto's office and say, all right, I'm willing to talk and make a deal here.
A negotiating tactic out of the Seattle Mariners that cost them $120 to $130 million would be quite the turn of events in Seattle's offseason. And you know what? I would applaud them endlessly for it. Let me say that. I will applaud you endlessly, ownership group, front office, everybody, if you actually go sign Blake Snell as a way to then leverage that as a way to get some bats back. Now, here's the only thing I'd say against your argument a little bit. if you're thinking about the Rays, I don't think the Rays are in on Blake Snell. So would the Mariners signing Blake Snell really make the Rays say, oh, now we'll trade Randy or Paredes? Or are you thinking more the Orioles and the Cardinals?
Orioles and Cardinals, but again, once Snell's off the market, that makes the demand of everyone else higher, and more demand equals higher prices, and the Rays don't want that.
No, but do you think they'd still, in that scenario, give away Paredes or Rosarena? I'm not so sure.
Probably not. I mean, I don't think they're giving away those guys anyways, judging the quotes we got from Jerry. If they were willing to give away those guys, I feel like the trade would have happened. Mm-hmm. It feels like it's more likely it would have happened, and we would perhaps be getting some different messaging. Teams can always change their mind, and again, we really will never know. But if the Rays' desperation level goes up, like it has to, even if they can't afford Snell, the guy under him, that the rest of the, let's say 5 teams are in on that starting pitcher, and they're all competing for him, and the price goes up and up and up, and we know the Rays can't pay that. So they'd be like, now we got to do what we can to secure our future starting pitching. And that's what it would cost. And that would be some brilliant strategy and just an absolute pipe dream, by the way. But man, would that be awesome.
And you could use the same argument for the Orioles, too. If the Orioles are, say, interested in Jordan Montgomery and they look at Blake Snell and say, okay, he's going to be too expensive. Dylan Cease, well, we've called on him, and the White Sox are asking for the world and back, so we can't do that. Then if Snell signs with the Mariners, Montgomery becomes potentially out of our price range because Boris manipulates this market, and we still need starting pitching. Then maybe they do get a little more serious about Miller and Wu. And then maybe in that scenario, the Mariners circle back to the Heston Kjerstads, the Kobe Mayos, the Jordan Westbergs of Baltimore system. And then maybe something potentially gets worked out. It's possible. So maybe that is what they're slingshotting here.
And Jerry calls Mike Elias and says, hey, I know you don't want to give up the world for 2 years of Dylan Cease, but would you want to give up the world for 6 years of one of my guys? 6 is better than 2.
Right. And the Mariners would not be asking for the haul that the White Sox would be asking for. They'd ask for a lot, but I think the White Sox are asking for things that are borderline ridiculous right now, which is why a Dylan Cease trade has not happened. Again, if Bryce Miller was traded for Kjerstad and Kobe Mayo, that could get it done. I'm not in the front office. I don't know for sure, but if I'm just spitballing here, between what we think is a fair price and then what the Orioles might be forced to do if all these pitchers go off the market, possible. Definitely possible. Now, I also think there's the possibility that they just keep all these guys because there's going to be some innings limits this year. Number one, okay, I shouldn't definitively say there's going to be innings limits, but Brian Wu blew past his innings limit last year. Nobody expected him to throw as much as he did. He did so. He did so beautifully. He kept the Mariners in the race all season long. He deserves a ton of credit. But that may have effects on him year 2 if they don't manage his innings. So I'm not saying this is a certainty, but I do wonder if the Mariners start Brian Wu out in the bullpen to begin 2024, have him throw 3 to 4 innings a week, and then maybe by May or so, they'll say, okay, now let's put you back in the rotation. And if that's the case, then you can't really afford to trade one of those guys because then it turns into DeSclafani starting or forcing Emerson Hancock into starting, and maybe the Mariners don't want to do that.
So is that you're anticipating injury, or is that a 6-man rotation? Because this is given Blake Snell is pitching.
I'm saying right. Okay. I'm saying if Snell had never happened and they still wanted to manage Wu's innings, then that results in having DeSclafani pitch. No, if you sign Blake Snell, the rotation can become Luis, Kirby, Snell, Logan, and then Miller in April. Wu could pitch out of the bullpen. And then once they feel like they've managed Wu's innings to a certain extent, we think, again, just from our eyes and what our data publicly says to us and the rest of the baseball world that looks at analytics and says, okay, Wu probably has higher upside than Miller. Wu seems to be valued more than Miller, at least right now. We would assume if Wu's innings are managed in April or so, or maybe the first 6 weeks of the year, and then they say, hey, let's get you back in the rotation. If there's no injuries by that point, Miller's probably the odd man out, and then you can move him to the bullpen, and he can pitch out of relief for a little while. And then if there's injuries, there's somebody that very, very easily slides right in, and everybody feels great about it. It's like, Bryce Miller's your 6th guy? That's pretty awesome. And then you don't have an issue with starting pitching. It was like Jerry said at the end of the year when he was asked about, like back in October, about trading one of the young arms. He says, look, you have starting pitching until you don't. Maybe his philosophy, if they sign Blake Snell, is just keep all these guys. Pitching's our strength. Let's use it.
Most importantly, this allows you to keep all of your best arms at the big league level. You could talk about sending guys down, and both Miller and Wu and Hancock, who will start in the minor leagues, all have minor league options. But wouldn't you just rather all the best pitchers pitch at the big league level as much as possible? I mean, I would. And another thing, too, is that Jerry said a potential fun bullpen addition. I think Brian Wu would be pretty fun in the bullpen. I think Bryce Miller would be pretty fun in the bullpen as well, as long as they're making you better and you're not trashing their future as a starter, not in any sense. Then why not do it? Like, we keep coming back to Dustin May. We've said this a couple times on this podcast. Dustin May, for his at least first full big league season, pitched out of the bullpen. And he did great for the Dodgers, and he had no issue with it. And then eventually, when there was space for him in the rotation, they slid him right into the rotation, and he took off. Unfortunately, he's been hurt for the last couple of years, hasn't gotten to throw all that much. But when he's been in the rotation, he's been very, very, very good. And you hope that the best way to season these youngsters is to keep them in the bullpen. You kind of limit their exposure a little bit. You have more time between outings to tweak things. You're not as tired. You're not as worn down. You're not relied upon as much. And it's like, hey, look at these Bulldogs in the rotation. I mean, you need to be just like the afterthought behind Ace Castillo, Ace Kirby, Ace Blake Snell, and very good Logan Gilbert. Those guys, just let them go do their thing. They're going to go mow down an opponent's lineup. The other two guys, like, listen, work your shit out. You got this. You can be a great major league pitcher, and these other four guys are going to take the pressure off of you.
Well, for all we know, by the end of year 2, with the way Wu's trending, he could be a near top of the rotation starter. That might be a lot to ask in year 2, but he could be very much trending that way or be on the Logan Gilbert track by the end of year 2 in terms of where his success is at, because all the data says that's who he is as a pitcher. So
Stuff-wise, sure. I will note those first 4 all 200 inning guys. I would be shocked if Brian Wu's 200 innings this year. He's going to be like 150 max.
Yeah, not even shocked. He's not throwing 200 innings. Sorry, you're right. I should say in terms of stuff, he could be that type of guy. Like, his ERA could be in the low 3s by the end of year 2, or at least in the mid 3s, the way Logan was trending after his year 2. But yeah, in that scenario, your pitching is just nuts. And it's like you said, they keep talking about we need to add another bullpen arm. What if your bullpen arm's Brian Wu or Bryce Miller? Well, that works out pretty well. That's a bullpen arm that can be really effective. And I kind of floated out the idea pre-recording when we were talking about this and throughout the last couple of days about, would one of these guys start in the minor leagues? They can make some short starts back in Arkansas, and then you manage their innings. And then we thought more about it, and we said, well, if you're going to do that, just put them in the bullpen. Brian Wu and Bryce Miller are both one of the 8 to 10 best arms in the whole organization. So if you feel that way about them, and you should, then they should just pitch in the bullpen, get their innings that way, and then they can still help you win games.
So if you ditch DeSclafani, so the payroll right now is at $118 million. Ditch DeSclafani, you give away all of his money. That brings you down to $106 million. Mm-hmm. And then you sign Blake Snell. Let's say Blake Snell signs his projected MLB trade rumors deal of 7 years, $200 million. I don't know if the Mariners go 7 years, but that's what the prediction is for MLB trade rumors. So let's just roll with it. That's a $28.5 million AAV for Blake Snell. That would bring Blake Snell's number up to... I just did some quick math. It's 134. Yeah, 134.5. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. So that's where it would be. And if we are at Ryan Divish's projected end of season budget of $145 million, that checks off the box I laid out on Wednesday of I would like $10 million to work with in season because you don't know what's going to happen. And that leaves you with that. You have about $9.5 million of space. You are within the budget. And most importantly, the team is better.
Yeah. For all we know, it could be more like $15 million in space. If they really have $150 million in their payroll budget when the season starts, then there's $15 million to add during the season at the trade deadline or wherever. And like we've talked about, the Mariners cannot have another trade deadline with a contending roster where you go out and get Adam Warren and Zach Duke and Cameron Maybin. That's what killed and tanked the 2018 season. And that's what jump-started this whole rebuild. They missed the playoffs that year. And they knew it was an aging roster.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have money to spend in season, then you can keep adding to get better. If Luis Urias works out at third base and he's really a 2 to 2.5 win player, awesome. But if you get to the trade deadline, you feel like you're a bat short, and a lot of what the speculation has been from the outside world, us included, about I think they need more bats, and then they don't have it come mid-July. Well, then at the deadline, you could say, let's see who's available. Let's go get somebody, and you have the money to do it. So then you can still improve the offense as long as you're in it by the trade deadline, and they should be.
And you can't even if you liked what the Mariners did the past trade deadline, the idea is to contend, remember? And the trade they made for Paul Sewell was not a contention trade, unfortunately, even though they won a shit ton in the month after with Dom Canzone and Josh Rojas. The trade itself at the deadline last year was not a win-now trade that did not add payroll to the roster. It traded payroll off the roster and Paul Sewell. So you need the ability to do a Luis Castillo level trade if you need to. If there is that kind of player out there that can push you to the playoffs, it needs to be available. I thought this was done. I thought Blake Snell was cooked. I thought the idea was out the window, unrealistic. Mariners are cheap, never going to happen. But the more we talk through this, and with Carabas's comments, I'm cautiously optimistic. I can't believe I'm feeling this way.
I know. I think the same thing, and I shouldn't be. It's stupid. It's moronic. It's ill-advised. It's fan brain, but I am thinking it. I am really, really thinking it. And look, we've talked about who Blake Snell is and what he brings to the table. We know he strikes a lot of guys out. He's got 2 Cy Youngs. He's got big stuff. He also walks a lot of guys. The Mariners could think that with their pitching program that they could help him cut down on those walks a little bit. But I just thought I'd remind people of that. And you guys probably do know. We don't need to spend a whole ton of time breaking down Blake Snell's profile. If you want to, we've done a previous episode this offseason doing so you can go back and listen to that. But all that said, I would still sign him. In a heartbeat, I would still sign him. And if you think you can't go sign the bats to go win in terms of, not to go win, but in terms of if you don't think you can sign the bats right now to make you a contender offensively like you want to be, do it through pitching. That's your strength already. Your rotation all of a sudden has Blake Snell as your 3 starter who just won the Cy Young. Well, that's a way to win ball games if you're just going to limit opposing offenses to less than 2 to 3 or to 3 runs a night or something like that.
And remember what I said about hogging all the starting pitching. All of your pitching becomes more valuable by acquiring all of it and making other teams be more willing to trade with you because you're like, there's less out there to sign. So I gotta get pitching any way I can. And they would be willing to make some trades and trade some impact pieces for your impact pieces.
I'll throw one more idea out there as we start to wrap this up. And you talk about having some payroll left in season. Now, this would be the extreme trade, but you mentioned if the Mariners need the room to make a Luis Castillo trade, you have to have some payroll budget available. We talked about Dylan Cease is probably getting traded at some point, right? We got dragged by White Sox fans for this at the start of the offseason. I'm going to bring it up again. If the White Sox are not contending again in July, and we know they probably will not be, at some point, Luis Robert's going to get traded. If the Mariners were serious about swinging a trade like that, and all of a sudden then he was on the table, well, you need some money to trade for him, and then all of a sudden, you have it. Now imagine that pipe dream of a world where you sign Blake Snell and go get 2.5 years of Luis Robert in July. Well, that team can win the World Series.
I like that. There's another thing I don't think we're thinking about with Blake Snell. I threw out that deal that was projected 7 for $200. I don't know if we're taking into account the flexibility Blake Snell will make to pitch in Seattle. I don't know what level he is willing to step down to come to Seattle and pitch. It could be a small step. It could be a big step. That is not made transparent. We will only know that once if he signs in Seattle and we see the contract, or Ryan Divish gets the information of what the contract number was that they offered Blake Snell. But that's entirely possible that he could make it very financially viable for Seattle to sign him. Say, they're like, hey, listen, we don't have as much to spend right now. Can we defer some money in the future? Can we defer a little bit of money? This has been the offseason of contract deferrals. Blake Snell, why don't we send a little bit of your money down the road so we don't have to deal with it right now and we have a little more budget to work with? How does that sound?
I like that idea. Pulling out the old Andrew Friedman trick, getting some deferrals on the books. I'd sign up for that. The Mariners can pay Blake Snell $4 to $5 million for the few years after his contract ends. That's fine.
Sign me up.
Sign me right up.
That works. That, or, I mean, they could throw some opt-outs in there. There should be some club options, mutual options, whatever he feels most comfortable with. They need to do whatever it takes to get him. Get him. I know people are going to hate us. People bash us in the YouTube comments all the time about Blake Snell and not wanting Blake Snell. Well, I'm going to just take a stance for Lyle and say we at the Marine Layer podcast really fucking want Blake Snell. Foot down.
I would love it. Because then all of a sudden, here's your offseason. You've signed Blake Snell. You've signed Mitch Garver. You traded back for Mitch Haniger. You got Luke Raley, who's a very good bat. Is that such a bad offseason? I mean, I guess you can throw Urias in there too. Seems like a decent offseason to me.
Cy Young and 3 bats? Yeah. If you said at the beginning of the offseason, 3 everyday starters and the Cy Young winner. Yep.
That would be quite the sequencing of an offseason, because think about where we started. We started with 54%. We're doing Mariners fans a favor. All that, just a couple days after the season ended. Then all the Root Sports stuff comes out. Everybody's going nuts, us included. We're losing our minds. Then Shohei signs with the Dodgers. It comes out that he got $700 million, and we see, the Mariners, they were not even close to getting Ohtani. And then all of a sudden, at the very end, you look up and down at your roster and you see you've added Blake Snell, Mitch Garver, Mitch Haniger, and Luke Raley. So like you said, Cy Young winner and 3 bats. Well, that would be quite the sequencing, and things weren't done in the order that people would have liked. But at the end, that would be a win of an offseason.
I agree. A win indeed.